Mass media theory is an integral part of for understanding how exactly news coverage reaches the audience. More specifically, the links between how media works from both a technical and structural standpoint and the impact it has on any given audience has been a staple of mass media communication research for a very long time and is incredibly important when trying to find conclusion, observation, and trying to, generally speaking, understand any given stakes. Now, today we will be seeing a few of those general theoretical frameworks for analyzing news media. We'll be talking about the magic bullet theory. We'll be talking about the hypodermic needle theory. We'll be talking about Lazarsfeld's model. We'll be also talking about agenda setting, about media framing, Overton's window, and we'll be finishing with a small discussion on the two-step flow of information model. Now, some of these models have been largely relegated to the past, but they still reveal some elements that are pertinent in today's world. The first theory we'll be talking about is the magic bullet, also known as the hypodermic needle theory. It was directly linked to observation of mass media effect under the Third Reich, under the Nazi regime, and the effects, of course, of Hollywood in the 1930s, 1940s. At that time, and in large part because of the theories of psychosociologists of the time, it was assumed that people were basically fully controlled, both biologically and psychologically, by their base instincts, and that they would react uniformly to any exterior stimuli. Now, this is why basically you see the idea of a magic bullet, as if a bullet of information was fired from a media gun, or a media or a inoculation of information vaccine was directly stuck into the vein of the public through an hypodermic needle. Now, the idea here and what is important is that this concept only works if you take under the consideration, if you postulate that the public itself is passive. If the public is reactive, or the public is critical of the information it receives, this whole system, this whole model basically doesn't work. The magic bullet and hypodermic needle theory, they originate from Harold Lasswell, a very, very well-known author in the first part of the 20th century of the mass media effects, propaganda effects more specifically. And this model, the hypodermic needle theory or magic bullet theory, was first written up in 1927 in his book Propaganda Techniques in the Third World, basically reinforcing the idea that these concepts originated in a total war. Now, of course, it's particular with the Second World War. It will be basically the summum of the influence of this model of information. What's also interesting in this model is that it has been used to illustrate some very well-known historical events. One of them is the idea of the War of the Worlds. Quick reminder, in 1938, H.G. Wells will diffuse at the radio. There will be a show called The War of the World, in which basically, for those who don't know it, it's about the fictional attack of extraterrestrial beings on Earth being reported live on the radio. And so basically it's like a fake news story that will last many hours, and in which basically you follow the attack of gigantic alien beings and structures throughout the United States. It will of course spark a very large reaction. There will be panic on a fairly large scale in certain areas in particular. Um, but basically, in one way, it's going to be the beginning of the end for this propaganda, for this information model, because quickly it's going to be thought about and it's going to be studied, and they're going to more specifically two authors, Lazarfield and Herzog, are going to say that basically the reaction to the broadcast were not specifically influenced by the radio channel itself, by the news itself, by the show itself, the radio show itself, but a lot of it will be, in fact, be caused by the environment, by seeing your neighbors being panicked, by seeing your family being panicked, by seeing your pastor, the mayor, the police, the sheriff, etc., being panicked to themselves to the radio channel, and this is going to be the more general reason why there is going to be widespread panic. Like in a subsequent study by Hadley Cantrill, it's going to be shown that reaction to the broadcast were actually determined, and I'll give you the exact quote here, by situational and attitudinal attributes of the listeners. So basically what it means is that it was not simply the information that created the panic, but it was the general context and specific attributes of each listeners that will in fact be the root cause of the general panic. In 1940, in the early 40s, the magic bullet or hypodermic model will be essentially put to rest, in large part through the studies of, once again, Paul Lazarfield. He's going to be studying the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1940, and trying to understand and to truly identify the links between, on one hand, media coverage of the election, and on the other hand, the electorate's attitudes towards the different candidates. And what he is going to conclude is that the audience was not helpless in this situation. The idea was discovered that, in fact, the public can and will choose which messages will affect them and which messages will not affect them. Therefore, it is not straightforward. It is not simple bullets that are fired and that will create a reaction from the media to the public. There are the causal link between those two are much more complex and implicate many, many different actors. So basically, this is where the hypodermic needle and the magic bullet theory starts to crumble, essentially. And it's going to essentially open the door to the next main model for information and news effects, and one that will last for, you could argue, much longer. In 1968, McCombs and Shaw will publish the Chapel Hill study that's going to show a very strong correlation coefficient between residents of Chapel Hill in North Carolina. By studying them, they will discover that there was a very, there was a sort of great parallel between what the electors thought was the most important issues of the elections on the one hand, and what the news media the national news media reported was the most important issues. So basically, it was an idea of trying to find not so much what people thought, but what people thought were the most important issues. And that is a very, very important distinction. There is a big difference between saying that the media are going to shoot information in people's brain, and by shooting that information in people's brain, the thoughts on those subjects are automatically changed. That's one thing. And there is a difference when you consider the media to be instrumental in what is considered by the public to be of interest. And this is the thrust. This is the main element between the agenda setting model, the agenda setting theory. The idea that the media is not so much responsible for what people think of any given subject, but they will be instrumental in telling the public what subjects should be most important to them. There are three different types of agenda setting theories, and it's two of those threes are particularly relevant in a course on stakes, for example. There is policy agenda setting or political agenda setting. So basically, it's trying to understand what factors are going to influence policymakers' agendas. Basically, policymakers, politicians are going to be treated as the dependent variable. The idea here is trying to study what exactly is what are the elements that are going to affect policy, essentially. What are the elements that are going to make it so that a politician is going to be interested in a subject or in a cause or in an ideology more than another? This is the policy agenda setting. The second one is media agenda setting, also known as agenda building. This model focuses on essentially what is going to affect the media's agenda, basically. What is going to affect what are the elements that are going to affect what is chosen for news diffusion. So basically, you could argue that sources, political or economic affiliations, publicity, many different other elements can be here taken into account in a media agenda setting, basically. And finally, you have the public or the audience agenda setting. Here, the idea is to study how the audience agenda, what their opinions and what is important to them, how that agenda is going to be influenced by other factors, basically personal, religious, cultural, economic, social, ideological, many different elements that are going to be taken into account when you're trying to identify what is going to be of interest for any particular individual or group. Now, in the past decades, mass communications research has largely focused on public agenda setting. That probably is the largest thrust of research in the field. And you could argue that where policy agenda setting is directly relevant to studies in, for example, political science, media agenda setting and public audience agenda setting is more far-reaching because it can implicate political science, obviously, but also communications, psychology, economics, social policy, and a great deal many other fields of research. Another element that is a bit linked to the idea of agenda setting is the concept of media framing. Now, media framing, the best way to illustrate media framing is as follows. Agenda setting and gatekeeping, because they are interchangeable, the idea of gatekeeping. What is the news that is going to pass through the media and what is going to be stopped by the news media? So basically, agenda setting and gatekeeping decides or explains what news is going to be covered and what is not going to be covered. Framing is essentially the study of how that subject is going to be covered. What angle is going to be used in order to present any given subject. Framing is an incredibly obviously ideological act, whether consciously or not by the mass media itself. And it's incredibly important also to understand that the framing of the given subject is going to have a large influence on how the public is going to perceive that subject. For example, it's not so much an angle, it's not so much a perspective. Framing is going to be incredibly relevant in order to truly understand what is the perception of the public on any given issue. Now, for example, if you have a large demonstration, hundreds of thousands of people marching through the streets, almost overwhelmingly positive, overwhelmingly friendly and non-violent. And in that procession, you're going to have one subgroup that is more aggressive, one incident, one fire that is started. You can be almost certain that the mass media is going to cover that extremism inside of an overwhelmingly friendly meeting. They are going to give it a disproportionate coverage for reasons that we'll be coming back to later. But one of the reasons, for example, is simply the idea of spectacle. The mass media will look at what is spectacular, what is exceptional. Coming back to somewhat what we were speaking about earlier, the ideas of ingredients. What makes something to be newsworthy and noteworthy in something that is newsworthy? Now, this is an incredibly good example on how news is not an exact representation of reality. In opposition, news is a construct, and the simple fact, the simple orientation of the lens can completely affect the perception that we have of any given subject. Just to give you an example, during the last student strike in Quebec a few years ago, it was incredibly interesting to see how the perception of that strike was radically different between residents of Montreal, for example, and residents from outside of town. Why? Because people outside of outside of Montreal would largely be informed of news through Québécois media, which is the largest media platform in Quebec. They are rather to the right, not full right, but let's say center right. They are pro-government, they are pro-business, and they were obviously anti-student. And in that whole meeting, every time that you had, for example, a blockade of a road by the students, or a metro that was stopped, for example, the coverage that was given of that subject was incredibly large concerning the real impact of any of those actions on on the scale of a whole city, which is a huge scale. But by showing the idea of the student strike by the angle, under the lens of its simply most spectacular events, the impression that you had was that basically the whole town, the whole city was under siege, which was incredibly far from the truth. It was insanely far from the truth. But it truly created a double perception of reality from inside of the town, from inside of Montreal to outside of Montreal. Inside of Montreal, there was a variety of news sources, obviously, but also people living day to day with the realities of that strike and were obviously understanding that what they were seeing on the news had no common ground with what was represented in Québécois media. So this is a very good example on the importance of media framing. And for any given subject, if you are able to understand how the media is framing the concept, the subject, your capacity to better understand that subject, to better have an idea of what is truly at stake, becomes incredibly facilitated. Various issues can influence how frames are created. Now, we'll be coming back on those subjects in the next few courses. But for example, economics is one, ideology is one, religion is one, the publicity is one, and more specifically, more often than not, the race, the class, the gender of both journalists, editors, owners, and the audience. The audience can influence framing. Now, what does it mean? It means that there are important concepts in psychosociology that directly link to this question of media framing and the orientation of news. And one such subject is the concept of cognitive dissonance. People are and cognitive dissonance in a different manner also confirmation bias. People are naturally looking to find news that reinforce their pre-existing worldview. Therefore, if you are a news channel or you are a news media, and you know that the opinion of your public on any given subject is overwhelmingly in one orientation, if you bring information that goes against that stereotype that is entertained by your public, you know you have a high risk of having part of that public simply leave your channel. This is why a lot of news media are going to instrumentalize their knowledge of their public, of the existing viewpoints of their publics, in order to advance news in an angle, in a frame that is compatible with their initial viewpoint. This is why in different media, the orientation can be immigration is bad, or immigration is naturally good, or immigration, they bring you your rapists, or immigration, they are the lifeblood of the country. Those orientations are not artificial. They are a construct, and more often than not, they are fully thought out strategies in order to keep your audience and keep them coming. Overton's window is an interesting concept that extrapolates on the idea of media framing. The idea is simple. It's also known as the window of discourse, and it was named after Joseph P. Overton, an American policy analyst. And the idea of Overton's window is that in the media there is only a particular frame on the you could say on a gradient of things that are from unthinkable to policy in the public discourse, both on the left and on the right. Therefore, there are some concepts, some ideas, some subjects that are completely outside the norm of acceptable public discourse. Overton's window essentially extrapolates on this concept and shows that on any given policy, on any given media, there is a bracket in which the subjects are considered to be accepted or considered to be acceptable and discussable. Now, it seems a lot of the defenders of current policies are, of course, going to try to say that anybody that goes outside of that window is dangerous, or has a discourse or an ideology that is unacceptable. And in the same way, it could be argued that the only way that society and that ideologies progress is when that window actually moves. For example, if you look at it historically, concepts such as the women's suffrage, the women's right to vote, would have 100 years ago or 120 years ago been deemed completely unthinkable or radical in the mass media, whilst now it is literally policy. The abolishment of slavery, drugs, racism are all concepts or themes that would have been considered to be perfectly acceptable and completely within Overton's window even a few decades ago, and that are today completely unacceptable. There is another interesting facet of this, is that politicians are particularly apt at staying within that window. Politicians are rarely going to be the ones trying to shift the window from one side to another. Why? Because they know exactly what kind of discourse is going to be deemed popular or acceptable by their electorate, and they usually will stay within that window because they don't want to incur the risk of losing voters. Most of the time, when Overton's window shifts or moves, it is because of mass media. It is usually the mass media, more often than not ideological mass media, that will shift definition and that will shift concept and coverage in order to have some elements that are that were considered to be unacceptable not so long ago, that will radically become sensible, popular, and therefore policy. The idea of Fox News, for example, is an incredibly good example of how Overton's window can be shifted by mass media. When you consider, for example, concepts such as such as immigration, for example, the discourse on a news channel such as Fox News is going to gradually become more and more radical, and by becoming more and more radical, it actually shifts the perception of what is acceptable. Now, the best way to illustrate this is, for example, suppose that you want to decriminalize all drugs. You want to decriminalize all drugs, or more specifically, you want to decriminalize marijuana only in the United States, for example. Of course, decriminalization of marijuana is still a sensible subject when it comes to the electorate. So what is the way to play with Overton's window when you have an ideological, or when you have a policy project or aspect or aspiration? You're going to sell the concept of legalization of marijuana not on the base of the legalization of marijuana itself, but on saying we should decriminalize all drugs. Every drug should be legal. Crack should be legal. Heroin, cocaine, everything should be legal. Because by pushing the discourse to something that is not considered to be acceptable, that is considered to be radical or unthinkable, what you are doing, therefore, is that you are making the idea of decriminalizing only marijuana something that becomes sensible, or that can even become popular, therefore augmenting the chances of it becoming policy. Therefore, Overton's window is a very interesting concept linked to media framing, but that should truly be viewed as a tool, first of all, of understanding what type of discourse is acceptable in any given public and any given media, and also as a tool in order to advance an ideology or an opinion on any given subject by the public of every one of those different media. Another such illustration for the concept of Overton's window was coined in 1998 by Noam Chomsky. He wrote, "The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum, even encourage the more critical and dissident views. That gives people the sense that there is free thinking going on, while at the same time the presupposition of the system are being reinforced by the limits put on the range of the debate." And that is an incredibly apt example. If you decide that the only acceptable discussion is between Big Mac and Whopper, well, you basically and the only discussion that is on the news is which is best between Big Mac and Whopper, you limit the scope of what is better. Maybe it's sushi, maybe it's buttered chicken. It doesn't really matter. But you limit the scope of the debate by simply putting the emphasis on a very limited choice of subjects. The final element we need to talk about today concerning the different theoretical models of mass media and mass information is the two-step flow of communication model. Essentially, it means that mass media itself does not directly influence what the public think on any given subject. Mass media tend to influence what opinion leaders think of any given subject, and then those opinion leaders are the ones to influence the followers. Now, the two-step flow of mass communications was developed in large part by Paul Lazarsfeld, and has been developed since 1944 and 1955 in a multiple of different theses and articles. Now, what is interesting with the mass media, because we will be talking in much more lengthy matter of the two-step flow of communication model, is that it is something that has been at the forefront of research in communications and influence for over 100 years. And it was initially developed or identified, you could say, maybe not so much theorized, but at least clearly identified in the First World War. During the First World War, the Committee on Public Information, or Creel Committee, was essentially the federal organization responsible for communications, for influence in the United States at the beginning of the First World War. And one of the main thrust of their research, the Committee on Public Information, was actually a group of journalists, publicists, writers from across the country that were tasked with influencing public perceptions of the war. And one of the main thrusts of that committee was the formation of the 4-Minute Man. Now, the 4-Minute Man were 75,000 different orators, public speakers, who gave in about 18 months over 750,000 speeches in 5,200 communities, reaching over 400 million listeners. These specialists, basically these orators, were given were identified by the Creel Committee as being opinion leaders in their respective communities, and were all tasked with giving speeches for example, before a movie representation or theater production or municipal council or any such public meeting. And because the message itself did not come straight from the government at Washington, but from figures that were well-renowned, well-regarded by the communities, those messages resonated in a way that could never have resonated through regular mass media channels. Therefore, this is the first illustration of the effectiveness of the two-step flow of information in a mass communication, mass information society. Now, we'll be coming back to different models, other models of public information, but as you can see already, the existing and those models already give you an interesting framework as to how influence can be manipulated and how perception of any given event or any given subject can be influenced by straightforward media structure and ideology.